Of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere and Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues will come to order. The title of the hearing is Summit of the Americas, a Regional Strategy for Democratic Governance Against Corruption in the Hemisphere. We're going to have one non-governmental panel testifying today with the following witnesses: Mr. Eric Farnsworth, who's the Vice President of the Council of the Americas, and Mr. Eric Olson, who's the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program at the Wilson Center, and I want to thank both of them for being here today. Both the ranking member, Senator Cardin, and I agree that this is a hearing that's timely, and it comes at a critical moment for the region. This week, the 8th Summit of the Americas will be held in Lima, Peru. The President was scheduled to attend. It's now been announced that because of events in Syria and the U.S. response, he will not be attending, but the Vice President will be attending in his stead. And his attendance at the highest levels of American government, with the Vice President attending, is an opportunity to demonstrate this administration's continued commitment to the region. The theme of the summit is anti-corruption in the hemisphere. And at the summit, it's my hope that the Vice President will build on this theme by promoting and showing the willingness of the United States to help our partners in the region build the capacity for good government practices. In addition, I also hope the Vice President will outline for our neighbors his commitment to actively partner with our regional allies on 3 important initiatives: regional security partnerships to take on transnational criminal networks, ensuring the fair treatment of U.S. businesses and firms in the region, and promoting the United States as a partner of choice over external state actors like China and Russia, who actively engage in unfair and predatory business practices in the region and around the world. But there is little doubt that the situation in Venezuela will and should be the dominant issue at this 8th Summit of the Americas. Venezuela, under the regime of Nicolás Maduro, as well as his cadre of other corrupt officials, has systematically dismantled the institutions of democracy in Venezuela. He created a fraudulent constituent assembly made up of loyalists to supersede the legitimately elected National Assembly. Instead of providing food and medicine for his people, he has purchased Chinese-made anti-riot vehicles and equipment for the National Guard to use to suppress protesters. He has enabled and encouraged the rise of pro-government gangs known as colectivos to repress protests through murder and to intimidate voters on election days. He has weaponized food. Venezuelans are required to provide government-issued identifications to buy food or to receive government-issued food and medicine. Maduro uses these identifications to reward supporters with access to food and medicine and to punish and intimidate opponents and their families by denying them food and medicine. He has used corruption as a weapon by rewarding loyal senior military officers with lucrative corruption opportunities, putting them in charge of the National Oil Company and of the distribution of critical consumer goods, which they can then resell on the black market or take for themselves. He has used his neighbors in Colombia and increasingly Brazil as a relief valve by allowing over 50,000 Venezuelans a day to cross borders to buy food that is unavailable in Venezuela. And just like his mentors in the Castro regime, they've done this since 1959, he has used migration as a weapon. Since 2014, over 2 million Venezuelans, the vast majority of them opponents of the Maduro regime, have abandoned Venezuela. This well-orchestrated strategy to replace Venezuela's democracy with a dictatorship has all occurred under the guidance of his puppet masters in Havana. It is both ironic and lamentable that a summit, which is supposed to be a gathering of the democratic nations of the region, has invited the Cuban dictatorship, which has authored the Venezuelan tragedy and the Cuban one before it, and a country which harbors fugitives of American justice, including the killer of a New Jersey police officer, and invites them to be a participant in all of this. However, it is promising that the summit's host country, Peru, has rescinded the invitation to Maduro to participate in this year's event. I encourage the Vice President to outline several initiatives to promote the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and to end the suffering of the Venezuelan people. The ranking member and I have worked on a couple of these already in a bill we hope we can get passed on humanitarian aid. The first is I urge him to announce that the United States is prepared to make an immediate and substantial contribution to a regional and international effort to provide food, medicine, and other humanitarian assistance to the people of Venezuela right now, so long as that aid is distributed by credible non-government organizations and not taken by the government to be used the way they're using food and medicine now. Second, it is my hope that the Vice President will announce that the United States is prepared to make a substantial contribution to a regional and international effort to help rebuild Venezuela once it has conducted free and fair elections for president, has abolished the illegitimate Constituent Assembly, and has restored the legitimate elected National Assembly. And third, I hope the Vice President openly calls on the nations that are members of the Organization of American States to expel the undemocratic Maduro regime from the OAS, a collection of democracies. Venezuela and Cuba are not the only threats to democracy in the hemisphere. Corruption is as much a threat to democracy as any single government. And there is no nation state that contributes more to corruption in this region than the government of China. The Chinese government is using bribery as a way of gaining contracts in the region and as a way of gaining political leverage to force nations to support their agenda, such as cutting off relations with Taiwan, and also as a way of creating an unfair playing field for American companies who seek to do work in the region. And I urge the Vice President to make it clear that this is unacceptable and that it will be a priority of this administration to aggressively confront the corrupt practices of the Chinese government and Chinese-controlled firms in our hemisphere. In addition, the summit also provides an opportunity to demonstrate that America intends to be not just a good neighbor, but a reliable ally and partner with our friends in this region. As evidence of this, I urge the Vice President to recommit our support for the Alliance for Prosperity with Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, to recommit his support for our trade and security cooperation with our allies in Colombia, and to demonstrate the importance of our vital regional partners in Brazil, a nation that has much to offer as a regional power and to the world, by announcing the permanent suspension of tariffs on Brazilian steel and aluminum. Since January of 2017, I believe this administration has made the Western Hemisphere a priority. Vice President Pence has already traveled to the region last year. He will return now for the summit. Earlier this year, both the previous Secretary of State and the Ambassador to the United Nations traveled to the region. As has been documented, the President made adjustments to our policy towards Cuba, and this President has demonstrated a firm and steadfast commitment to democracy in Venezuela through a series of sanctions against the Maduro regime that have been calculated, well-targeted, and measured, and that have been done in conjunction with our allies in the region. And what I think is an unprecedented regional response. We haven't seen this in decades in our part of the world. And I think this visit by the Vice President to the summit also shows our strong commitment to the region. This weekend, the Trump administration has an opportunity to demonstrate that its decision to make 2018 the year of the Western Hemisphere are not just words, but rather words that are backed up with real actions. This is what I hope they will do, and this is what I believe they will do. And now I turn it over to the ranking member, Senator Cardin.
Chairman Rubio, first of all, thank you for not just convening this hearing, but your leadership on these issues.
Thank you. I'm just going to begin with a couple of quick questions and then turn it over to the ranking member. Just on the point of the prosecutions, you talk about Brazil, Peru, other places. Obviously, we would prefer there not be corruption, but the alternative to no prosecutions is impunity. In essence, there was a time not long ago, and there are countries in the region like Venezuela and in other parts of the world where corruption is rampant. Everybody knows it. There's never any prosecutions or accountability. So in some ways, while we're not happy about prosecutions because they're evidence that there's corruption, there's some good news embedded in the fact that courts are now going after the most powerful people in these countries. They're standing trial. They're being convicted. The system is working. So it proves that institutions and laws are functioning. And that's a good sign when you see that. So even though there's bad news that there's corruption and the instability that comes with it, the good news is that the processes and the institutions seem to be working and gaining momentum in at least certain parts of the region. Is that a fair way to assess it?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's good news that prosecutions are taking place. Look, corruption has been a problem in Latin America for decades, for a long time. It's not new. What's new is people holding high-ranking authorities accountable. If you look at impunity rates, the rate at which people are prosecuted in countries like Mexico, it's well over 95%. So that means people are not being prosecuted, and what we need is that level of prosecution, independence of prosecutors to go after the high-level people. Now, I would just add one small thing. Where we've seen success, such in Guatemala, there's been a really strong pushback from the elite and the powerful, and I would say probably corrupt in that country, against these very institutions, against the Attorney General, against the Attorney General of Honduras. The Honduran Attorney General was attacked again last night publicly by people who say he's, not doing a good job. He's trying to hold people accountable. And this is going to be a difficult long-term process, and we need to support those prosecutors and judges who are being independent and taking this on in a very dangerous situation.
Did you want to add anything, Mr. Trump? You don't have to.
I agree.
Okay. Well, the second question I want to ask you about is kind of this situation that's developing in Venezuela with this so-called election. My view, and I'm pretty confident that I'm correct about this, is that Maduro is trying to follow a pattern that we see Putin pull off in Russia and others in different parts of the world, where you conduct this election, you win it, you're pretty sure you're going to win it, and this somehow gives you this air of legitimacy, but he needs there to be enough turnout to do it. And part of it is he thinks it'll be a reset button that kind of resets everything and allows them to restart, perhaps taking away U.S. sanctions and the like, and some of the regional sanctions. But the other part internally is it allows him to go to the elites that have doubts about him, and elites meaning the people who are still benefiting from him being in power, but who are starting to wonder if maybe one of them shouldn't be the person there, because maybe they can make this model a little less broken, and show them that his political party is able to gin up, mobilize people to go out and vote, et cetera. He is willing to undertake this election, and I was almost begging for an opponent, wanted an opponent, because I believe he knows he can control the outcome. He knows that through the distribution of food, he can reward people that vote for him and punish those that do not. Ultimately, their control of the electoral oversight body allows them to change results if they needed to in order to win, and all that sort of thing. The counter-argument from some in the opposition is that he could steal a close election, but for him to try to steal a blowout in which he loses would be much harder. And a lot of them are calling for activism. And I think one of the things Maduro's counting on is that the Venezuelan people like to vote. So what views do you have on that? How do they participate, not participate? It's a tough issue for someone living in there. We view it, we can see it for what it is. It's a fraud. And that's why none of the international organisms will go in and supervise it. But what is your view on whether or not the opposition there, or some elements of the opposition, should participate or not in this election versus abstaining from it as a sign of how fraudulent and fake it is?
Thanks, Tokayo. Mr. Chairman, that is a really difficult question, and I think first I would suggest that those who choose to vote in Venezuela and exercise their franchise, I think we can't criticize them for doing that, particularly if their vote depends or their livelihood depends on voting. For example, their access to food, medicine, their job, as you've indicated. So I think that's exactly right. One of the things that this government in Venezuela has done very, very well is to divide the opposition, has to set the opposition against each other, has been to jail leading opposition figures, not allowing them to contest elections, prosecuting others, trying to really use the tools of the state in a very politicized way to undermine the opposition. This is a perfect example. It's no coincidence, I believe, that the election date was changed to May 20th, Cuban Independence Day. I think that there is a real effort not only to get out the Chavista vote, and there is a core group of supporters in Venezuela that will turn out and will support President Maduro no matter what. The question is, if a plurality or a large number of others turn out to vote, can he claim legitimacy from the result? And I think from the international community perspective, I think by definition he can't. It's not a legitimate vote. Every indicator would be that this cannot be a free and fair election under existing circumstances for some of the reasons that you mentioned, and there are others as well. So whatever the individual decision of Venezuelans to vote, I think is probably appropriate based on their individual circumstances. But as we look at it from outside, no matter what happens, this is going to be a vote that's fraudulent, is not free and fair, and I think in advance, the Summit of the Americas leaders who are meeting this week can and probably should have something very direct to say about that.
And I think there's this broader narrative that this sort of reveals when we talk about corruption and the decline of democracy. And if you just look at the world and sort of the 5 flashpoints, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, radical jihadists, the one thing they all have in common is authoritarianism. In some way, shape, or form, obviously China is an authoritarian society, Russia the same, North Korea is a bizarre place, Iran is authoritarian, and radical jihadism is either, obviously it's not a democratic process, but oftentimes it's even created by authoritarianism because repressive governments that do not allow people opportunities for upward mobility and the like create a ready population to seek membership in a group that makes them feel influential and powerful in society. So we still analyze so much of foreign policy in the 21st century with the lens of the 20th century about the Cold War and the like, where there was an ideological dispute between the United States and the spread of communism. It was authoritarian, but for the purpose of advancing communism. This is authoritarianism for the purpose of furthering something else, primarily control, the projection of strength and order. And so the Cold War ends in 89 through 91, and then everybody says that it's the end of history, right? And everyone's going to become a democracy. Markets are going to solve all of our economic problems. And we took that for granted for 15 or 20 years. And we just thought if we open up to China economically, they're going to become more like us, and the same with Russia. Well, it didn't necessarily work out that way. And what we have seen as well is that these economic changes at the global stage disrupted people's lives tremendously. It displaced people economically. It moved, you add to that automation and the like. And so what happens in these societies that feel a lack of order and a lack of stability and tremendous insecurity? You become vulnerable for the authoritarian figure that stands up and says, I'm going to restore order. I'm going to make things right again. I'm going to make us, a more powerful country and the like. It's certainly critical to Putin's argument. And it explains Russian interference, because as part of that authoritarian argument, they point to the U.S., the beacon of democracy, and say, look at these guys. They're at each other's throat. The elections are illegitimate. I'm convinced that that wasn't just the goal in 2016. I think it will be the goal from here on out, to disrupt elections and create doubt about whether they're legitimate. I mean, imagine, I said this in the open hearing at the Intel Committee, imagine if you're able to go in, change people's voter registration, so when they go vote on election day, they tell them you're not registered to vote. You do that to enough people, using analytics to do it to one party disproportionately, and enough of that goes on in this environment, and you're gonna have on election night people out there saying this was a fraudulent election. You undermine American democracy, you've undermined the liberal world order in terms of democracy. That explains a lot of what they're doing there, and explains part of what's happening in this hemisphere as well. We have a lot of these countries with rampant corruption, rampant criminality. Life is so bad that people are willing then to take some of the most dangerous journeys imaginable to escape and try to come to the United States, and you've created the territory and the environment for strong men and women to stand up and say, I'm going to restore order with a firm hand. And so look how this region is divided. On one side, Bolivia, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Ecuador seems to be migrating away from that model somewhat, and that's good news. And then there's everybody else to varying degrees. So as much as anything else, what's happening in this Western Hemisphere is an extension of what's happening globally. And that is a debate between those of us who believe in the democratic order, even though sometimes it elects people we don't agree with, and leaders in other countries we don't agree with, and those who seek to spread their model of authoritarianism as an acceptable model for the 21st century. And it is, by the way, a reminder of why our leaders, and I mean including the president, need to be very careful about complimenting authoritarian leaders, even though they happen to be our allies on a particular instance, because it demoralizes the democratic order. And I'm not here to tell you that every country in the world, that Syria can become New Zealand overnight. I am here to say, though, that I think it is important for us to always try to promote steps towards a democratic order, because democratic countries have proven to be less likely to, for example, start wars unnecessarily, invade their neighbors unnecessarily, and the like. And so I guess my question is, aren't what we're seeing in this hemisphere just part of a broader global trend in this sort of ongoing 21st century battle between authoritarianism on one side, the argument that authoritarianism is a valid and legitimate and perhaps a better way of governing, versus, but disguised as a democracy. They have these elections that they pretend are real, versus sort of stale commitment to democracy in the countries that have taken it for granted, that basically think that once you have a democracy, it self-perpetuates and it doesn't need to be fed and defended in each generation and protected.
Mr. Chairman, if I can jump in there, I think the short answer is yes. Latin America and the Western Hemisphere is part of a broader global shift that we're seeing underway. You know, one of my favorite quotes, I believe it was when Ronald Reagan spoke to the British Parliament in 1983. He said that in the garden of democracy, democracy is not a fragile flower, but it does require tending. And just as you laid out after the Cold War, we assumed that elections meant democracy in Latin America, and we collectively forgot, in my view, to tend to the garden and deal with these very real issues we've been talking about, to the point where they have now become quite difficult. And the truth of the matter is they provide a permissive environment for those outside of the region who wish to meddle, the ability to do so. And that's precisely what we're seeing with new tools, new interests, new opportunities to do that, to try to undermine democracy throughout the region. I think that's exactly right. You know, the National Endowment for Democracy, I think, has done some very important work in the concept of sharp power, which is the use of non-military power to promote a certain vision globally. Both Russia and China and some other countries are using that very effectively in terms of the pursuit and the promotion of their own interests. I've been an advocate for a long time not to try to say to other countries around the world, you have no business in Latin America, you can't come here, this is not for you. I mean, Latin America is part of the global environment. That's appropriate. Here we are. You know, Latin America can trade with anybody that they want, subject to international law, et cetera, et cetera. But where I think the vacuum has been created is in the U.S. engagement with the region. I mean, this is a huge opportunity to contend for the region, which I think collectively and over a number of years we just have missed. And whether it's walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whether it's calling into question essentially all of our trading, our formal trading arrangements in the Western Hemisphere, starting with NAFTA, but perhaps with others, whether it's presenting a vision that shows the United States to be less welcoming to our Latin American and Caribbean friends than we have traditionally been, this is something that resonates in the Western Hemisphere quite loudly. And so it plays into a narrative that a Russia or a China or somebody else can say, well, the United States is not interested in you, they don't care about you, we do, and we want to trade with you, and we want to be your friends. And if I'm a Latin American and I'm seized with that choice, it's really no choice at all. I mean, the United States may be the preferred partner, but if China, for example, is the only partner, there is no choice. And that's, I think, what confronts the United States as we go to the Summit of the Americas. We need to show the hemisphere that we are an engaged partner, not just based on our own interests, but we're partners for the region to help promote their interests as well. And if I can be a little bit flip, we want to help make the Americas great again. We want to promote a regional identity that the United States is very much a part of, hopefully in a leadership role in, but recognizing for precisely the reasons you've just laid out, Mr. Chairman, this is not an isolated hemisphere. This is not a region that is just over here and everybody else is conducting their affairs here. This is part of the global community, and I think it's time for the United States not just to recognize that, but to engage with the region on that basis. And I think we have a lot to add. I think we have a lot to contribute, but we have to want to be able to do that. If I can make a very quick point, if you'll indulge me on Senator Kane's, I think, important question on Honduras. The point that hasn't yet been raised in this hearing, particularly in the context of Central America, I think is a really important one. That's the role of the private sector. The private sector needs to be a voice for democracy. The private sector needs to stand up and loudly reject corruption. And whether it's in Honduras, whether it's in Guatemala, whether it's across the region, this is something that I think would make a meaningful contribution to our collective efforts in the Western Hemisphere. And the final thing I would say about that, so that Eric Olson doesn't have all the fun here, my mother was also a missionary in Honduras.
Just on the question you said about the private sector, are you meaning U.S. companies? Because by law,
that is a very good clarification. What I'm referring to specifically in this instance is the local companies, right? The indigenous companies or companies that are based in those countries. U.S. companies are subject to FCPA, all the requirements of U.S. law, and those who don't abide by them, subject to U.S. law, et cetera, that's appropriate. But you know, Eric Olson is talking about some of the resistance that whether it's Sieg or Moxie are getting from their domestic constituencies. That's not U.S. companies that are pushing back. The private sector flourishes when the business climate is open and transparent and fair, the rules of game are known, and there is a rule of law that can be implemented and that people know the rules of the
Just
game.
because a side note I want to make is within the context of everything you just outlined, in a culture and an environment, economic culture and environment where corruption is at a minimum accepted and maybe even perhaps encouraged in some places, that's where we get a lot of complaints from American companies seeking to do work in the region is, and obviously they can't under our law participate in that, but then they often talk about Chinese firms that come in and basically flat out bribe their way into contracts that then, if they're big enough, give them significant leverage over those countries' geopolitical decisions at international forums. I mean, that is the huge issue that bears watching in the years to come.
I agree with that.
And just as we close, a couple of points on this competition. You know, the world has always been influenced by whatever the most powerful country in the world's model is. And there's no doubt that the fact that the most powerful country in the world after World War II was a open economy, democratic nation had huge influence on the way many nations developed. And now we're in this competition with this autocratic model that's making an argument. They point to our problems because we're an open society. So we broadcast the issues that we have, and we argue about them in front of the whole world and in front of each other, and they don't. I mean, any bad news in China and any bad news in Russia is suppressed by state media that doesn't allow it to be reported. It's propaganda. And so they point to our model and say it's dysfunctional, it's broken, you know, look what we have. But they have another benefit, and that is they come at a very low price, at least in the front end. They don't care about your human rights record. We'll sell you weapons, we'll sell you stuff. I mean, we don't care what you do. We don't care what kind of government you have. We don't care if you're corrupt, and we don't care how many innocent people you kill. These are not conditions. Ours comes with all sorts of strings. They'd rather have our stuff, and I'm for it. I'm not arguing that we should remove those things. I'm just telling you that's the presentation that is made. And so oftentimes you will see where nations in the region, for example, will make a military purchase of another country. They'd rather have our things, but they're going to buy theirs because it doesn't come with the strings attached, and they actually would sell it to them, or they'd rather have ours. This is not an argument for lowering our standards. It's just one of the pitches that they use. But all being equal, they'd rather have our technology. They'd also just rather be closer to us. They are suspicious of Chinese intention. They are suspicious of Russian intentions. And they would prefer to have a relationship with us. There's cultural links, geographic links, historical links, but they feel neglected. And I've heard that now over and over again for the better part of a decade. No matter who is in charge, they feel that the United States gives lip service to the Western Hemisphere, but largely neglects it. And therefore, it kind of makes it vulnerable to this sort of activity. I am not critical. I am disappointed the president won't make it to Lima. I understand the Syria situation is very significant, and he's going to stay here and handle that. I'm not criticizing that decision. I do find it, however, symbolic of the broader challenge we face in the region for the better part of a decade, and that is every time we say we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, something emerges in the Middle East or somewhere else that distracts our attention away. And in this particular case, it's happened once again. And you know, Senator Cardin and I have a bill on war crimes accountability in Syria that we're hoping to get passed through the Senate. So it's a priority for us as well. But ultimately, the last point I'll make is the one good thing that has happened, and is over the last year and a half, we have seen a regional cohesion among the large economies, the most important regional powers on the issue of Venezuela. And I do think the administration, whatever criticism people may have about them on some other issues, has handled that one well. They've been measured, they've been strategic, it's been slow and steady, they have targeted, they've taken their time in finding the right things to sanction, and they've done it in a way where it's not us telling the rest of the region what to do, but rather in partnership with them. And it is telling that these nations, Panama being the latest, have followed suit, as has the European Union and the Canadians. And I do think embedded in their approach towards Venezuela is a way forward on a host of other issues in the region where we are truly partners and see in Brazil, in Colombia, in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru, in Mexico, force multipliers. Nations whose, as their capacity grows, their ability and their regional leadership could be an asset and already is in the furtherance of these principles that we care about. It's a region that we want it to be a source of good news, not bad news, a source of solutions, not problems. And it really begins by capacitating these countries who are following these examples and helping them to the extent we can, often simply by engaging with them. I mean, Argentina doesn't need a lot of foreign aid. They want to buy stuff, but Colombia is a good example. This is a nation we've invested in significantly. They have real problems. We don't have time to get into them today on the peace deal and the like. But this is also a country that's helping Honduras by sending trainers there. So there's a lot here. Obviously, we could have dedicated a lot more time to this hearing, but I want to thank both of you for being a part of it and making it a priority to be here today. And this committee obviously is focused on this, but I hope we can encourage more of our colleagues to get engaged in Western Hemisphere matters. So again, the record for this hearing will remain open for 48 hours. And again, thank you both for being here. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.